Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first Startup Fundraising 101 webinar. We are so excited to chat about the art of building strategic partnerships, how founders should think about fundraising, relationship with investors, and what are some common mistakes that they make. I am Shubhi, a group product manager at Carta, and prior to my role here, I used to be that founder without a real VC network who had a fundraise for their company, which is why I'm really excited to have Arpan Shah on our webinar today. Arpan is both an ex-founder and an investor. He is a partner at Pear VC, focused on enterprise infrastructure, AI, and fintech. Before that, he was an early engineer on the founding team at Robinhood. And he also started his own company, Flannel, and sold the company to Plaid. The jokes just write themselves. Thank you so much for being here, Arpan. Really excited to have you here. Really excited to dig into your experiences, both as an investor working with companies and an ex-founder who raised capital. So to start us off, I'd just love to talk about how you approach fundraising the early stages for your company. How did you think about it, and what was your seed round like?
Thanks a lot, Shubhi. I'm really excited to be here as well. Really appreciate kind of this conversation. I think it's so important. For us, we were raising in the middle of the pandemic, and we actually didn't have an easy time going and meeting customers in person as a result of that. And so we leveraged a lot of our investors in our network of friends we knew who were investors in an early way to try to validate our idea and honestly get feedback on it, because we had some thoughts around how this product could be really valuable for customers. But we only knew so many of those potential customers. So we used our network to really try to get validation, feedback, and then introductions to a lot of those customers in the earliest stages. So that was kind of the first thing we did. But there's so much more to it as well for our seed round.
How did you meet investors? How did you approach fundraising? When did you start? Did you think about it from as soon as you came up with the product idea? Were you waiting for the right traction? What was your strategy moving in?
Yeah, so the problem we were focused on was around money movement and faster payments. And we noticed that problem originally, my co-founder and I, at Robinhood. And so the first thing we did, honestly, was try to figure out whether there was something there beyond these specific circumstances at Robinhood. And we learned that there were. So we really took the next step after that to try to look at our own network, folks we knew, folks we had spoken to over the years who could help us with that idea. And so that included financial institutions where we had friends or we knew folks from our previous lives, or investors. And our idea at the time was mostly just to make sure that we were completely confident that we had all the data points and feedback before we actually went and started raising money. So our first outreach to investors was really not from the perspective of, hey, we're going out and raising money, this is how much we want to raise, this is what we want to do. It was more around, this is the space we're exploring, these are the key questions we're trying to answer, this is what we think we might build. Do you have folks in your network who we could talk to? And I think that was really valuable for us, because we figured out very quickly which investors did have deeper networks in those areas, and which investors were able to help us amongst those. And the good thing was, because a lot of these folks were friends already, there was not that added pressure of trying to pitch as soon as you kind of met them.
So you reached out to them way before.
Yes,
you
were probably 4 or 5 months before we were actively fundraising. Yeah.
And then how did you keep that relationship going? Were you going back to them with investor updates? Were you just telling them how your company was doing? How do you keep
great question. Yeah, so for us, it was, and I think this worked really well for us, which was, as we were learning more and more about our customer journey or, the specific product we might want to build, we were going back to those investors and telling them, hey, thank you for those introductions. This is what we learned. This is, what we're focused on next in terms of figuring out what we're going to build. And this is what we're seeing in terms of the market as we're kind of researching it. So those updates from us were a way of thanking these investors. So letting them know, we appreciate their help. At the same time, it was a way for us to also take the next step in that journey and get feedback on it. So we would kind of report back our learnings, and they would often, mirror back to us their own perspective on what we were sharing and what we were seeing. And in many ways, that actually helped us refine a little bit of our thinking as well. And honestly, when we eventually went out to fundraise, they were already caught up to speed. What I think really worked for us was the fact that they could see our progress and our rate of learning, which honestly for investors, especially early on, is one of the best signals for a team that can execute. Is how fast is this team iterating, how fast is this team learning, how are they approaching customer discovery, how are they approaching that whole process.
That's super fascinating. I feel like the investor founder relationship can be a little weird sometimes because there is like a power dynamic there. And so when you think about approaching these relationships, how much of this is like being very transparent about where you are in your process? And then how much of this is like, oh, I want to build a relationship, but I know there is an end goal to this relationship and I shouldn't be naive about it.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it's, every investor conversation, to be very transparent, the investor is assessing you as a founder. And, I think it's very important to keep your eyes wide open about the fact that, your role as a founder is obviously to build the right product, get the right capital you need for that product, and then find those customers. But for the investor, the perspective is similar, in the sense that they also have goals. The goals are, how do we find the best companies and how do we invest in those companies, and ideally invest in those companies at favorable valuations and get in as fast as possible, right? And so keeping those things in mind, I think it's important to have a clear idea about that is happening. But at the same time, I think that the relationship can be very symbiotic in the sense that your goals as a founder are to obviously build the right product. Investors oftentimes can see a wider lens of what's going on because they meet companies all the time, so they can give you feedback beyond what you can already see. And at the same time, that feedback, while it might be harsh, can actually help you refine your idea. And so the way we honestly thought about it at the time was like, look, if we can't get conviction after talking to these investors, or if these investors give us feedback and we can't convince ourselves to still continue down this path, that means we need to do a little bit more thinking. We need to do a little bit more work on this idea before we, really feel like we should go and build here. So we saw it as a positive and not actually as a big negative. But it is important to make sure that you're keeping that perspective in mind, that the investor, every conversation is gonna judge you a little bit. That's their role. And vice versa, you can do the same as a founder. You can see, what investors you might want to work with long term. And this, right? It's like, I think, easier to end a marriage than end an investor relationship, right? Like you once they're on your cap table, they're there for a long time. So it's valuable for founders to be thoughtful about who they're partnering with.
Yeah, it can be equally acrimonious. And if you look back on like your relationships with your investor, is there any particular relationship that jumps out where you got advice that particularly resonated well or really helped you guys out through your journey?
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of those, investors. I think, without taking names of the specific fund, but, there was an investor who had been a friend for a long time, and she, was super effective at introducing us to banks. And so, we initially wanted to make sure that we could talk to and understand how the money movement ecosystem within the banks would work for our product. And so, we really wanted to go and talk to some of the largest banks. And we had some connections with some of the smaller FIs out there, but she was extremely valuable in making those introductions. And honestly, as a result of that, we ended up having a great relationship with her as well through that whole process.
Amazing. Let's flip it over to your now role as an investor. And I mentioned this up front, and I had this experience. I came to San Francisco with not a real network here, and then I had to I built a company and I tried to fundraise. And I think one of the most common questions I get even now is, how do you do that as a first-time founder? Like, how do you reach out to investors when you don't really know anyone in the community?
It's a great question. And I think that this is something that, so I grew up in India, and, when I first came here as well, I didn't really have a strong network. I was fortunate that through my time at Stanford, I was able to build a little bit of that. And then, my role at Robinhood when I joined them super early allowed me to, again, be a little bit more connected. So if you do have friends or friends of friends, it's valuable. I would say the 2 or 3 biggest things I can think about first are warm introductions. So if you have folks who can speak to your ability to build or your insights of a specific domain, and they make an introduction for you, investors are very likely to take that seriously because, every investor knows that, that's the best source of high quality folks in your network. And so I think that that's extremely effective.